Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, August 25th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Happy to be back on the channel.
Uh, we were talking before coming up to this live, we were talking about the situation in Gaza and the way that the Europeans and people in France are talking about it. We said that it is a pure racism, what's going on, and the way that they're talking, they're picturing the situation in Gaza. Your take on that? What's happening in the mindset of those people who are still supporting Israel in what they're doing in Gaza?
Well, I mentioned this case of this lady. She's a journalist, and she said on TV that the value of a Palestinian baby is inferior to the one of a Israeli baby, talking about Gaza. And that's absolutely shocking. And when you see, especially coming from France, who used to be the country that issued the human rights at first, um, it's shocking. But at the same time, you can see that countries like Germany, France, all these countries, and that affects also these countries in Eastern Europe, by the way, that used to be very close to the German during World War II, they have today a policy very much in favor of Israel. Probably they try to compensate. I don't know, but it's fascinating to see that in Europe we haven't really taken the lessons of World War II. You see, World War II, at the end of World War II, as we discovered the concentration camps and all that, and you had the Nuremberg tribunals or trials, it was two ideas emerge out of that. The first one is that we should have, armies should follow law. They should be war should not be conducted in an empty intellectual or legal space. It has to be a legal framework, and armies should work within a framework. And in various books I wrote, I try always to make the difference between the use of force and the use of violence. In France, there is no real difference between the two. They tend to use always the use of violence, but there is a difference. And I remember having talked about this in the American doctrine. There is a difference between the use of force and the use of violence. When violence is something which is uncontrolled, that's something where you just fight around. That's the Israeli do. Use of force is when force is controlled, and that's the purpose of an army. The rationale for an army is to have a command and control structure. When you use force, it's directed, it's controlled, it's aimed at specific objectives. It's not everyone shooting at anybody. That's why in modern states we have these national armies. That's precisely to have a command structure in order to make the most efficient and effective use of force. We don't have a way of doing things where everybody has a weapon and shoot around. This would be totally ineffective. So the use of that, and that would be violence, by the way. And that's very much what you have when you have gangs shooting around, or people when you have riots. That's violence. Force is when you know exactly what you are doing. It's commanded. And the problem is that the Germans used to confuse the two. We also have to understand that in German, force and violence have the same word, Gewalt. And That's why a lot of people, when they translate the use of force from German, because that was a concept that used to be developed by the German, they tend to confuse the two terms, violence and force. In German, it's the same word. And that explains probably the way the Germans acted during World War II. The thing is that after World War II, we understood that we need to have a clear view on the use of force, and we should have a responsibility, accountability, for instance, and hence comes the international humanitarian law, or what we used to call the law of war, because that's the purpose. That's to make people accountable to what they do, and there is no excuse not to be accountable for something. You cannot, as we have heard many times during the Nuremberg trials, oh, it was not me, that my boss told me to do that, so I did. This is something which is today, after 1946, totally unacceptable. You cannot hide behind an order, and that's something that applies to all modern armies, that every soldier has the right to refuse an order which is against the humanitarian international law. If you receive the order to shoot at kids, for instance, at babies or women or unarmed civilians, things like that, you have the obligation to refuse. This is in the international law. That's part of the international law. And in most armies, civilized armies at least, you have in the regulation, you have this obligation to refuse an order which goes against international humanitarian law. In Switzerland, this is explicitly stated in the code of conduct of the soldiers, for instance. So that's the first thing that came out of World War II. And the second thing that came out of this experience was the respect for civilians. During World War II, you had only limited legislation as to how civilians should be treated in war. And hence the Geneva Convention and the additional protocols that came in 1949 and then in the 70s and things like that. But before that, you had only limited. You had some legislation. It was not an empty space, but it was limited. And the Germans, by the way, used to hide behind this, saying, well, we had no legislation, whereas common sense and the sense of humanity should have dictated the behavior. In any case, and a sense of honor for a soldier, because killing babies has nothing to that make a soldier great. It makes you dishonorable. Unfortunately, what we have in IDF now in Israel is, for me, a shame for all uniformed people in the world, because it shows how soldiers can be so dishonorable, without honor. Now, it is nothing. This is really, these people don't deserve any kind of respect. But because that was one of the two lessons of World War II. Now, it's interesting that since October 2023, this was, of course, there was huge criticism against Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces. And in order to go, I mean, that was mostly, and I think for most people in Europe, they were not against the Jews as such. They were very much against Israeli, and not even against Israeli, but against Israeli behavior. And I think when you could see and talk to people about what was happening in Gaza, I'm talking about October and 23 and beginning of 2024. It was very much this idea that the behavior was not correct, but it was not the idea that people were rejecting, I mean, Jew people or Jewish people, sorry, and or the religion. It was not related to that, but there is a distortion that was brought by the Jews themselves, especially in France, where France has the biggest Jewish community in Europe, apparently. I didn't verify, but I think it's true, as well as the biggest Muslim community, by the way. Meaning that in France, the tensions are very strong, especially because the compassion for the Palestinians very strong in France, because you have a lot of Muslims, a lot of Algerian, and Algeria, has a country that supports very actively the Palestinians, and therefore you definitely you have tensions, but the French government and the Jewish community, because they felt obviously attacked by the criticisms that were very strong. But instead of trying to explain and try to rationalize the discussion, they came back to the old recipes. As soon as you do something to somebody who's Jew, it's automatically anti-Semitism. I mean, you hurt with your car, you hurt a guy on the street, he happens he's Jew. I mean, if he says you said that you did that because of anti-Semitism, then it's done, you see. And this is this old recipe, which is extremely perverse. And that's what the Jewish community did, saying that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. Whereas being anti-Semitic is directed as a religion, I mean, as the nature of what you are, while anti-Zionism is a posture against a political posture, because Zionism is a political ideology. So for me, there's a huge gap between being anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. By the way, you also have Christian Zionists. I mean, Joe Biden used to say that he was a Christian Zionist, and you have many others in the U.S. establishment who are said. I mean, not said. They have declared. They're declared Christian Zionists. So that's how being anti-Zionist has nothing to do with anti-Semitic. But the problem is that the Jewish community tried to make this confusion in order to be able to condemn any condemnation of yes.
Colonel, can we say that Zionism is a combination of nationalism and racism?
It's certainly a nationalism, and Zionism is an extremely complex movement, if you want. There are so many. If I have here you'll see this is a leaflet. It's in French. It's a leaflet of the Zionists. This is the faction that led to Benjamin Netanyahu faction of the Likud, by the way. And you see, incidentally, you see the map that is portrayed here. That's Israel and Transjordan. And this is a faction of the Zionist movement that used to be headed by Mr. Jabotinsky in the late 20s. That was called the Zionist revisionists. And those were in favor of the revision of the idea, the British, not the British, the idea, but the British decision of giving Transjordan to the Hashemite tribe and kingdom. It became eventually the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And in order to push the British to revise this donation and to this decision, Jabotinsky created this idea of the revisionism. But Zionism is essentially a nationalist movement. The problem is that when it comes to the occupation of Israel, it is also a movement that originated in Europe. It didn't originate in the Middle East. And Jabotinsky, as most people, I mean, probably most of the Israelis in Israel have absolutely no ties whatsoever with the Middle East. And that's why DNA research in in Israel is extremely touchy, because there is, I mean, if you try to trace DNA, you will find something else than roots in the Middle East, as most say 2,000 years and all that. This is the Bible, but this is not where the actual Zionists from Europe come from. And and you have to read the books of Shlomo Sand, who is a historian, a Jewish historian. He's a professor at the University of Tel Aviv, if I'm not wrong. And he made huge research on that and demonstrated that, in fact, those who are the most, let's say, those who are really originating from the area are, in fact, the Palestinians. They are those who have the most ties with the region. The Israelis, especially those we see, are all Eastern European. I mean, Central European. They come from the area of Poland and Ukraine, and that's also very interesting, because you see when you compare the two conflicts, you will see there are a lot of commonalities between the two conflicts because of the behavior of the mentality is very similar. And this is a mentality, nota bene, that in Ukraine you have always this kind of ambiguity between let's call them ultra nationalists, to be polite and to avoid any problem with YouTube. But to take a polite terminology here, and the Jews. And when the Russians used to talk about neo-Nazi and all that, people said, no, it's not possible because Zelensky is Jew. But you have, nevertheless, this kind of ambiguity. And we see now in Israel, we have the behavior is very similar. So they might not be obviously the same ideologies as what you had in Germany in the 30s, although during in the 30s, you had, even in Germany, it's very important to make the difference between Zionists and Jews. And Zionists in Germany in the early 30s were in favor of the new party that came to power in 1333, because the policy of that party was precisely to expel all the Jews. And that was the same objective that the Zionists had, because they wanted to occupy Palestine. And Palestine at that time was occupied by the British, who used to be the competitors, if we can call it that way, or the enemies of Germany. Meaning that, I make the whole story short, but you had a lot of, let's say, cooperation between the Zionists and the power in Germany. Now, you had also in Germany Jews who were called integrationists, so the assimilationists. Sorry, so there were people who wanted to remain assimilated in the German population, and they were opposed to the Zionists, and the Zionists tried to. In fact, we have also example that the Zionists used to fight against the Jews. I mean, you have the case of the ghetto of Warsaw, for instance, where you had Zionist factions fighting with the Germans against Jews in the ghetto of Warsaw. So you have a lot of examples like this. So this is an extremely complex relationship that we have between Zionists and Jews, and to avoid any discussion on that, because that's something that even the Jews in Israel find, and it's a taboo. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's extremely touchy, obviously, for because it will destroy the whole national narrative, if you want. And for that reason, the word anti-Semitic is used also to define those who are anti-Zionists. So there is still this idea. The problem with that, by using this kind of confusion, you make all the Jews somehow responsible for what the Israeli government does. And that's not fair, because you have a lot of Jews who are opposed to that, especially in our countries. They are opposed to the policy of the Israeli government. But when you start to qualify any opposition um, to the Netanyahu, or what Israel does, when you try to qualify this as anti-Semitic, then you put all the Jews in the same pack, and therefore you make the Jews, the honest Jews, responsible, or having a co-responsibility in what's happening in Israel. And that's something that is very strange, but it's a way to avoid the discussion with the against Israel. We have to see that most of the Jews in France, not most, but a lot of them, are of Polish origin. These are Jews that emigrated uh, just before the war or just after the war, and a lot of them have Polish or even Russian names. And they are extremely Zionist, most of them. And what you have in the media in France is extremely pro-Zionist, and therefore they don't have any problem hiding behind the honest Jews, if you want. If I can make the distinction between honest Jews and Zionists, if you allow me this distinction, just for the sake of the explanation. But and so there is a perverse situation, because it, especially in France, because since you have, as I said before, a very important Islamic community, then the Jews themselves have created a confusion that in fact creates more anti-Semitism, because therefore everything is anti-Semitic, and the others say, well, that's the same, since the Jews themselves say that being Jewish is the same as being Zionist, then we. But the idea, if you look in history, you would see that only the Christians have created problem. In fact, when you had for centuries Jews and Muslims living perfectly well in all around the Mediterranean area, in Iran. Iran being a case in point, by the way, where you have those two communities living peacefully, and you have, and I think we mentioned that in your channel, you have even Jewish soldiers serving in the Iranian army, by the way, which is quite unique, because there you don't have that case in Arab countries. But that shows that Muslims and Jews have lived always very peacefully in the where they were together. When you put a Christian in that start to be problem. Christians have had problem have had problem with the Muslims, and they have problem with the Jews. And now we have European Jews in the Middle East, and they are the problem, because those who are in Israel are totally different from the one who used to live, grow, and have their roots in the rest of the Middle East. So the Europeans are the problem, and there is this kind of this idea of kind of superiority, probably, that probably the Israelis coming from Central Europe are combining the worst of two worlds. You see? I mean, when we see what's happening, it's definitely the worst of two worlds. And a lot of people in Europe, because we used to say that we are part of the same Judeo-Christian civilization. But you have a more and more scholars saying, well, the Judeo-Christian civilization doesn't exist. There is no Judean-Christian. And to be honest, I don't feel any common values with those who are in Israel today. And I'm closer to what people say the Helleno-Christian society, which is Helleno comes from the Greeks, which is a combination of the Greek civilization that uh, influenced the Roman civilization, and later, of course, the European civilization at large. So saying a Helleno Christian civilization is probably more accurate to define the way Christian Europeans understand the world, see the world, the so-called, as the Germans say, die Weltanschauung. That means the way of understanding the world is probably closer to this artificial idea, which is, by the way, rather recent, of Judeo-Christian. And I could have accepted that as long as I don't see what's going on in Israel. And I see there, I have no common points with those people at all. Definitely not. And I think a lot of people start to think that way. But of course, that the problem with that, there is a problem behind this, is that it creates more gap, or it widens the gap between the religious community, which is something, when I was young, nobody paid attention to that. I mean, I was raised with the idea that we should had. I mean, I was born well after World War II, but still, in the family culture, the education I received was to have compassion for the Jews, and we should refrain from making a distinction between religions, and that everybody is equal. They have different ways of thinking, and I mean, you know all that. So this idea of true equality, and I was raised in that way, and I lived in my life. I tried to see it that way. But today, to be honest, I question all that, because I say, well, did we have the right picture? Did we have the right picture? Did we understand the things as they were, or did we? Is my education based on an ideal world? And the real world is the one we see today. So I think it's a very important question that we should probably raise, and the Israelis should probably think about it, because I think what's happening today in Gaza, and I mean, when you hear exactly what I said before, that the value of a Palestinian baby is inferior to the one of an Israeli baby, what is the kind of world in which we are, you see? And I think that will affect the perception of the Israelis, certainly, but also probably the Jews at large, because we tend to create this confusion between what is Jew, or what is Jewish, and what is religious and what is political. Because of that, probably will have an increasing anti-Semitism for a very long time. And this is, and it's interesting, because we have the US ambassador in France just wrote a letter to Emmanuel Macron just a couple of days ago, to criticize the French policy for saying that they are promoting anti-Semitism, or not doing enough to fight anti-Semitism. It's ironic. I mean, the policy conducted by the French government is probably, in fact, promoting anti-Semitism, but not for the same reason as the one the US suggests, not because it prevents any criticism of Israel. I would suggest that if we would allow the criticism of Israel, not to fight the Jews because they are Jews. And that's also the difference between criticizing someone for what he is versus what he does. And that's a fundamental issue of the international law, by the way, or law at large, so that you can condemn someone for what he does, but not for what he is. And the confusion we made between Jewish and Zionist creates exactly this confusion, and therefore, I think most people are against the Israeli because what they do, not because what they are. And since we tend to put everything in the same pack, probably, in fact, by doing the wrong approach to the problem, and again, it's always the same thing. Because you misunderstand the problem, then you have the wrong solution. There's always that. The way you understand the problem, it indicates or guides the way you solve it. And that's exactly the problem of the French government. They wanted to be accommodating for the Jews, and therefore they accepted this idea that you can merge Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and all that. As a result, you have, and I think an anti-Semitic, a pure anti-Semitic act should be punished, while anti-Zionism, I mean, it depends. When it's violent, it should be punished. Of course, we're talking about something rational here. But when it's anti-Zionism, when it's about criticizing the Zionism or the policy or making even demonstrations against Zionism, I think should not be punished, because that's part of the political freedom and the freedom of thinking, freedom of thought, and all that. When you criticize something for his religion, that's something different, because that comes in the area of racism and all that. Because definitely you start criticizing people for what he is. It's the same with the skin color and all, what, even nationality. I mean, I'm Swiss because I was born Swiss. I mean, I never asked to be Swiss. I'm happy to be Swiss, by the way. But you know, but if people would say no, you cannot access this just because you are Swiss, this would be racism. And that's, by the way, we are back to the laws that were adopted in Ukraine in July, or the 1st of July 2021, that make a difference between the ethnic Russians, I mean the Ukrainian citizens who are of ethnic Russian extraction, versus the others who have other extraction, and they have different rights. And here again, we are exactly in the same. That's why you see, you can say Zelensky is a Jew, but the fact of the matter is that the laws that have been adopted in Ukraine are similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the one that the Germans used in 1945, which used 35, sorry, which used to be called the Nuremberg laws, that made a difference between the German citizens who are of Jewish extraction and the German citizens with other extraction. And we have exactly the same thing, probably with some nuances and differences. But the fact of the matter is that you make a distinction based on what you are and not on what you do. And that's the fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. And that's exactly the problem you have in Israel. This is, we can define the laws as racist because they make a difference based on what you are and not on what you do. And that was exactly the same thing in Ukraine. And in fact, if you study the two conflicts, we see that we are in exactly a similar situation, that the Palestinians, in fact, are fighting to protect their population, the Palestinian people, against an occupation. And the Russians attacked Ukraine in February 2022 to protect the Russian population of Ukraine. And that was recalled by Sergei Lavrov just a couple of days ago, meaning that we have here a similarity of the Russians on one side, the Palestinians on one side, fighting to protect a population against another population that tried to exert a violent power on a minority. And this is where you have this similarity, and that's come back to something that I wanted to mention here, because this is the responsibility to protect. I've mentioned that a couple of times, which is a principle of the United Nations that was adopted in 2005 based on the sad experience of the Rwanda genocide, and that gives the states a responsibility to protect the civilian population. So each state has a responsibility to protect its own population. That's the first pillar of the R2P, or responsibility to protect. The second pillar is that the international community has a political responsibility to help the states which have a problem to solve the problem and to protect the minority in its under its responsibility. And the third pillar of this responsibility to protect is that if the state is not able to protect its own population, if the international community, as for instance the UN resolutions that aimed at protecting the Palestinians and the occupied territories and so on in Palestine, if the international community is not able to enforce the protection of the civilians, then there is a right to intervene in Israel. So, based on that principle, the international community could intervene in Israel, trying to bend the Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. And in fact, if we think about it, only the Houthis are doing that, because they have said we will fight and exert kind of a blockade, especially in the Red Sea, against Israel and bomb Israel as long as they don't accept a ceasefire with the Palestinians. And that, in fact, it's probably the only country in the world, with probably the exception, I mean, Hezbollah is not a country, but probably Hezbollah falls under that category as well. But this is the only country that, in fact, has taken the responsibility of enforcing the principle of the responsibility to protect with their own means, with what they had at hand and what they feel they can do. But nevertheless, this is the only case. I mean, no other country has even tried to make pressure over the state of Israel to prevent massacres, to prevent the violations of the human rights, the violation of the international humanitarian law, that means the art of war, not the art of war, but the law of war, sorry, in Gaza. And it's interesting because even my country, which is the depository state of the Geneva Convention, has applied something like more than 3,500 sanctions against Russia. Switzerland is the second most sanctioning state against Russia, by the way. That's interesting, even before Canada. So since February 2022. So Switzerland has applied so many sanctions against Russia, but none against Israel. So that shows, unfortunately, that my country is a racist state, because they accept that there is a difference of treatment between what is done in Ukraine and what is done in Palestine.
Colonel, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, we see that Ukrainians are using drones to attack one of the most important oil refineries in Russia. And we had the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, talking about that the United States doesn't believe the conflict in Ukraine will be resolved overnight, but he hopes that peace will be achieved no later than in 6 months. Do you believe that he's talking about the timeline that he's talking about? He's 6 months. Donald Trump came to he was elected telling us that he's going to put an end to the conflict in 24 hours, and more
Well,
than 6 months he was in power and nothing happening yet.
let's say, okay, I I'm fair with Trump, and I would say 24 hours is probably a rhetoric exercise, and we can accept that. Anyway, it took 6 months to Trump to figure out what the Russian position was. Because, in fact, what we have seen in Alaska just 10 days ago was, in fact, about figuring out what was the Russian position. Although this position was explicitly stated on the 14th of June 2024, meaning 1 year ago. So it took 6 months to the US administration to figure out something that had been explicitly said and which has not changed by 1 millimeter. So can we assume that they can solve complex problem within 6 months? I doubt that. Anyway,
Is
I
that,
don't know.
Colonel, is that related to the stubbornness of the current government to understand what was going on? Because Donald Trump was somehow aware of what was happening in Ukraine, because he was talking the way that before being elected. He was giving us, showing us some sort of signs that he understands what's going on. But it's not the case anymore, in my opinion.
No, the question is the problem is, and that was probably the purpose, or not probably, that was the purpose of the meeting in Alaska. It's knowing the position of Vladimir Putin is one thing, but understanding which are the margin of negotiation. What are they ready to accept or to concede on both sides? This is what probably was missing. But the fact that they came over and over with the proposal of Keith Kellogg, and what apparently, after Keith Kellogg was replaced with Steve Witkoff, they came up with very similar ideas. There were not much change, apparently. So, meaning that they haven't even understood the very basic stance of the Russians. And that's probably why Trump needed face-to-face discussion with Vladimir Putin, so that he understands firsthand what is the Russian position, in order to understand what the Russians are ready to give or not. The thing is that the more the conflict moves ahead, the less the Russians are prone to give up something, to make concessions, because it's not in their interest. This is certainly one aspect. So I don't have the crystal ball of J.D. Vance, and I don't know if it will take 6 months. My view is that it would probably take more, but who knows? The thing is that we have moved forward. We have to admit that. Because what has changed, and I think it's a very important change, is that we talk to the Russians. And this is probably this kind of instinct of Donald Trump to understand, probably because that's his way of doing business, I don't know. But he understands that to understand someone, you need to talk to people directly and to feel people. And that's already something. I mean, they resumed diplomatic relations, they opened new communication channels. So there is that moves forward. And probably this first step, which the Europeans were not able to make, were made by the Trump administration, which is a huge step. Probably it was the most difficult, because once you have understood that you can talk, then a lot of things happen. And we have moved forward in a sense that today nobody talks about NATO membership for Ukraine anymore. This is off the table. Everybody understands that somehow Ukraine will have to accept the loss of territories. I think that's also something. So we have a couple of things moving forward, and there also this issue of the ceasefire, which Ukraine wanted absolutely, the European as well, but we have seen during the roundtable exercise that was made in the White House last week, that when this issue of the ceasefire was brought up by Friedrich Merz and others, this was wiped off by Trump. He said, "Well, I think the best way is to go directly into a peace process rather than a ceasefire that doesn't work," meaning that, in fact, a lot has been done, at least at intellectual level, at the highest level of the in US. And since it's a proxy war between, Ukraine is a proxy war between the US and Russia, and we see that the Europeans basically they don't have the resources, the means, the imagination, the fantasy, the initiative to counter what Donald Trump proposes or does. We can assume that we are on the right path. However, obviously there is a lot of things that needs to be done once you have accepted the principle of ceding territory. There are a lot of issues related to that. Obviously, I'm not even talking about where the delineation line goes. I mean, whether it's a front line or the contact line or the administrative borders of the four region. I mean, all that needs to be sorted out. But there are other issues such as the recognition of that de facto, de jure, and. So this is a lot of efforts here to make. And since we are not talking about a NATO membership, there must be something that satisfies the Ukrainians instead. Therefore, the issue of the security guarantees and all that, which is here, I think it is probably one of the most misunderstood problem in the whole story, because these security guarantees are understood by the Europeans as kind of an alternative to NATO. And that's definitely not what the Russians understand. And to make my point better or clearer, I would explain that when Switzerland in 1815 became neutral, it was just after the French Empire collapsed, and the tiny Switzerland in the middle of Europe wanted to be neutral. And the big powers that were surrounding Switzerland at the time, Prussia, Germany, the British, and Russia is an important one, they decided, because they found that they had an interest having a neutral state in this particular position in Europe, because Switzerland is the center of Europe, is a junction point in Europe, and therefore all these powers understood their own interest in having a neutral state there, and therefore they united to guarantee the status of neutrality of Switzerland. And I say that because in 1955, as Austria, as it was an occupied country, as Germany, and you had occupation forces in Austria, all the four winners of the Second World War, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians, and Vienna itself was divided in different occupation zones. In 1955, it was decided to grant independence to Austria. And I found a very interesting document of the CIA that was written in April 1955 that suggests for Austria the same recipe as the one that was used for Switzerland 1 century before. And effectively, that's what happened for Austria. The four winners of World War II became the guarantors of the security guarantees to Austria. And why do I mention this? Because in 1994, as it was the issue for Ukraine to give back the nuclear weapons it had on its territory to Russia,
which were Russians, by the way.
Which were Russians. Yes, they were Russians. But there was some issue on that. By the way, yes, they were Soviet certainly, but then there were problem of the ownership, and that's an issue that between 1991 and 1994 had a lot of discussion about who owns them really. Even if the Ukrainians had not the technical capabilities and capacities to use those weapons. They had not the maintenance capacities. They had not the command and control capacities. They are not the reconnaissance and satellite targeting system, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the question of ownership was still in discussion. Nevertheless, Ukraine accepted, under the US pressure, by the way, to surrender that weapon to Russia, because Russia was the signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in that capacity, the US considered that Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, had the responsibility for the liquidation of these weapons and so forth. Therefore, United States make pressure on Ukraine to have these weapons back to Russia. In any case, Ukraine wanted some guarantees, and in drafting the guarantees in exchange of the nuclear weapons, Ukraine used the model of what happened to Austria in 1955. Meaning the same model that the one that was used for Switzerland in 1815. Meaning that instead of having a guarantee, guarantors coming just from one side, they wanted to have guarantors from all sides. And in March 2022, when Ukraine or Zelensky asked the Russians to have an agreement and to have a peace agreement, by the way, for solving the conflict. In the draft, the Ukrainians submitted to the Russians, they used exactly the same idea, to have guarantors coming from all sides, with the idea that if there is an issue with the territorial integrity of Ukraine, all the guarantors should sit together and solve the problem, first politically, and if necessary, by force. But they had to sit and to do that together. And I think that was a very wise proposal by the Ukrainians at the time. And I think and the Russians, I think, are very happy with that solution. And that's what the Russians would like to have today. The problem is that you have people like Emmanuel Macron or Friedrich. They don't understand this because they don't understand the mentality. Ukraine has twice used the model that was even, in fact, been drafted somehow in 1815 for Switzerland. And the problem is that Emmanuel Macron just sees the relationship always in a balance of force. That's the problem. Therefore, they always propose to send troops and things like this, and it's very confrontational. And the idea of the Russians, and in the draft that was eventually scrapped because of the intervention of Boris Johnson and the French and the Germans, by the way, in April 2022. This idea of having a group of guarantors coming from all sides is something that goes exactly along the Russian idea, and I would even say the Soviet idea of security by cooperation instead of security by confrontation. I think it's a very interesting concept that, in fact, we mentioned that. I think I have mentioned that on your channel. I don't remember. Probably I did. In any case, in the early 70s, the Soviets tried to create a system that would allow this kind of relationship between East and West. And this system evolved into the Conference for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has become the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe. But you see the two words, security and cooperation. And that was created at the initiative of the Soviets in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think it is the idea of the Russians that the security architecture in Europe cannot go along a confrontation system as we had during the Cold War. That means the Warsaw Pact on one side and the NATO on the other side, the two watching themselves and fighting if necessary, if it should occur. The idea was, since the Warsaw Pact was disbanded in 1991, the idea would be to have a much broader organization, probably based on the OSCE, by the way, that would make everybody, let's say, working with each other. Hence the whole idea of the indivisibility of security that the Russians have mentioned many times, which has been in many international treaties, including the Astana Declaration of 2010, that says that you cannot have your security at the expense of the security of your neighbor. And that means that it's an idea that promotes good relationship with your neighbors. Security by cooperation instead of security by confrontation. And I think that's always what the Russians have had. And I told you that in the early 90s, Switzerland was contemplating the idea of joining the Partnership for Peace. I was part of a delegation that was designed to analyze the perception of other state of Switzerland participating to the Partnership for Peace of the NATO, because we are very keen to keep our neutrality image, something we have lost since then, but this is another story. In any case, at that time, we were very keen to keep this image of neutrality, and therefore we explored with several partners and actors how they would perceive Swiss neutrality if we would enter the Partnership for Peace. And we went to Washington, D.C., we went to Brussels, NATO, EU, and we went also to the Russian High Command. And the Minister of Defense with the intelligence as well, and but especially the Russian high command. And had very interesting at that time, interesting discussions with the highest level of the German, the German, sorry, the Russian command, and they were mentioning this idea of security by cooperation because they realized that NATO was outdated. It was no longer of use because it was not structured for the new type of problems we had in Europe at that time. Russia was completely in chaos. It was trying to reconstruct itself based on new principles and all that. Of course, Russia was very interested in developing a relationship and constructive relationship with the West. And that was probably the same in all other Eastern European countries. Therefore, there was a need for extended cooperation. At that time, there was also no need for, let's say, military confrontation because we understood that Cold War was behind us and it led nowhere, and there was no reason to fight. And therefore, this idea of security by cooperation was already mentioned at that time. And I think what we have today in terms of security guarantees or what we could have as security guarantees for Ukraine could be shaped around this idea and based on what the Ukrainians themselves proposed in 2022. And I think that would be my personal view is that it would be a good idea. But the problem is that people in Europe tend to confuse security guarantees with NATO or with peacekeeping, which is something slightly different. By the way, if you want to have peacekeepers in Ukraine, that can be anyone except European countries, because the Europeans are party of the conflict. And a peacekeeper, by definition, and I just remind you that I used to be head of the policy and doctrine of the United Peacekeeping Operations in New York. But the issue of peacekeeping requires that you are neutral, impartial, and you are not bound by any political influence. And basically, I would say that if you want to have peacekeepers in Ukraine, that would certainly not be French, British, or German troops. It could be Brazilian troops, for instance. It could be Pakistanis, Indian. These countries are very keen in providing peacekeepers all over the world. And that could be coming from these countries, which have a very, very competent, very capable military, and have experience also in peacekeeping. So that would be this kind. But that's not what the French see. They still see they still have this idea of deploying troops in Ukraine and things like this. This shows that the West, and especially Europe, has absolutely no, let's say, no strategy, but not even a sound concept of what they want to do. The Russians instead seem to have very much precise idea of what could be achieved. They seem to be very much, they have studied different options. It is much more thoroughly thought. The Americans, they want to achieve an objective, but they don't have a strategy to reach that objective. And as I said before, we are a step further because Trump wanted to open the door to the Russians. And I think that's a good step. But the problem, he has no concept to define how to move forward. He just opened the door and now he doesn't know what to do. That's the problem of the Trump administration. And the European, it's worse because they didn't want to open the door. Now the door is open. They didn't want it, and now they don't know what to do. And they propose they come back with the old recipe: send troops somewhere. and that's all. But there is absolutely no idea, no concept, no initiative, no fantasy. There is no imagination in the way they can represent what it could be and what could be an opportunity for everybody, because obviously continuing the war is an opportunity for nobody except for the Russians, maybe. This is only an opportunity for them, but certainly not for the Ukrainians, and certainly not for Europe. And I think that's something the Americans have understood, because that's the reason why Trump wants to get out. I mean, he understands, US has now how much? $37 trillion of debt, and they pay as interest 1.2 trillion, $1.2 trillion a year for just the interest, meaning that obviously they have no money to spend more on a conflict that will lead nowhere. And therefore, that's why they want to get out of it. And they understood that there's absolutely no opportunity continuing the conflict. For the Europeans, they haven't borne the cost of the war. Therefore, for them, the Europeans, they wanted the Americans to fight for them, the Ukrainians to fight for them, but they don't do anything. They just emptied their old storage and sent the equipment that was not even functional. They sent it to Ukraine, but they never wanted to commit themselves directly to the conflict. And now they will start to understand what it costs and what the consequence of waging a war, since the Americans don't want to do it anymore. And with this pledge of Zelensky to buy for $100 billion of US weapons, of course, with European money, the Europeans will start to understand that making war costs something. And probably that may change their perspective. I mean, again, I don't know, but that's probably what we will see. And therefore, I don't know if this will last for 6 months and or so, but certainly the Europeans will start to understand that if the Americans are not here to fund the war, it will come upon them to do it. And I'm not sure they are ready to do it, to be honest. And therefore, this may help to accelerate the move towards peace. Again, a part of the path or the road has been done by accepting the idea that there will be no ceasefire. By accepting the idea that Ukraine will have to cede some territory, and so on. So some work has been done so far. We just need now the Europeans just need to realize that if the Americans go, they will be the only responsible for that, and probably it would be a good idea to seize the opportunity and to make peace somehow.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.